On the 14th of July 1518, in the heart of Strasbourg, a strange phenomenon began. A woman named Frau Tropia stepped out of her house on a narrow cobblestone street. In Alsace, she began to dance. There was no music, no festival, and no explanation. She danced non-stop throughout the afternoon, then through the evening and all night. By the end of the first week, 34 people had joined her. By the end of the month, the number had risen to 400. They danced until blood flowed from their shoes, danced until their hearts stopped. Some danced to death. And the Strasbourg City Council, witnessing the scene, made a decision that has forever puzzled medical historians. They hired musicians, built a stage, and believed that the cure for uncontrollable dancing was to dance even more. But the death toll continued to rise. To this day, no one, neither then nor now, has reached a definitive consensus on the cause of the 1,518 Strasbourg dancing plague. However, a hypothesis that remains silent for decades and is increasingly difficult to dismiss points to a fungus one that, in another city 2,000 years earlier, may have been the most carefully guarded pharmacological secret of the ancient world. Historian John Waller meticulously documented the Strasbourg event in his 2008 book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die. His analysis identified 10 similar collective dancing events in the Rhine Valley, from 1374 to 1518, each occurring during periods of extreme social stress, famine, and religious anxiety. Waller's preferred explanation is mass psychogenic illness, a well-documented psychological phenomenon in which shared trauma produces shared physical symptoms, spreading through the community like an infection. Hysteria, a well-documented phenomenon in which collective trauma manifests as shared physical symptoms and spreads through the community like a disease. This is a serious, evidence-based argument and deserves consideration. But historian Mary Kilbourne Matassian spent years mapping something else. In her 1989 book, Poisons of the Past, she correlated medieval ergotism epidemics with weather patterns, grain types, and geographical distribution. She found that outbreaks of what medieval Europeans called street, Anthony's fire, a disease causing convulsions, burning sensations, and black necrosis of the limbs, clustered with astonishing consistency in wet years following cold winters. Cold winters, wet springs, a diet primarily of rye. These were the optimal conditions for infection of grain by Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus. Their staple diet was rye, and those conditions were ideal for grain to be infected by Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus. Weather records of Alsace for the years 1517 and 1518 show exactly this pattern. The people of Strasbourg subsisted mainly on rye bread. When ergot fungus infects rye, it produces a family of alkaloids, including derivatives of lysergic acid, the same chemical family from which Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD. 25. Number 25. In 1938, Hofmann was working at the Sandoz laboratories in Basel. He accidentally poisoned himself with a microdose in April 1943. His account of that afternoon, cycling home through the streets of Basel while the world melted into geometric hallucinations, became one of the most famous stories in history. Historical pharmacological records reveal that the compound that subdued him derived directly from ergot fungus, associated with demonic imagery. Recorded in European chronicles from the 9th to the 15th centuries, sensations of insects crawling under the skin or burning pain match the pharmacological properties of the same alkaloid group at higher, more chaotic doses. The 994 epidemic in Aquitaine, France, claimed about 40,000 lives and was recorded in the chronicles of Adhemar of Chabannes. Modern historians confirm it was ergotism. The 857 event in Xanthen, Germany, is similarly documented and retrospectively diagnosed the same. In 1976, historian Linda Caporiel published a seminal paper in Science. She argued that the Salem witch trials of 1692 were, at least in part, an ergotism-related event. The accused exhibited convulsions, reported seeing apparitions, and felt crawling sensations under their skin. These symptoms align well with ergot alkaloid poisoning. Salem's geographic location, a cold and wet growing season, and a predominantly rye-based agriculture matched the conditions Matassian had indicated. A 2009 meta-analysis published in Environment and History synthesized 50 years of research on medieval ergotism. The conclusion indicated that a significant number of demonic possession cases in Europe could be explained as mass pharmacological events viewed through a religious lens. Mass hysteria does not blacken limbs. Psychological panic does not cause gangrene. Medieval descriptions of St. Anthony's fire focus on vascular symptoms, not psychological ones, exactly the vasoconstrictive effect of ergot alkaloids on a community consuming contaminated bread for weeks. Ergotamine, a refined derivative from the same fungus, is today on the WHO model list of essential medicines for treating migraines, and has been used since the early 16th century to control obstetric hemorrhage. The same substance, the same molecule, kills farmers in one century and heals patients in the next. And here is where it gets chilling. When you sit and reflect long enough at Eleusis where you are about to go, the evidence indicates that ergot was used deliberately in controlled doses, creating a controlled transcendence for nearly 2,000 continuous years. In medieval Europe, that same compound caused mass terror, convulsions, epidemic dancing plagues, and witch trials, simply because no one knew it was present. The same molecule, two completely opposite outcomes. The difference is not in the chemistry, but in the knowledge. What happened to that knowledge between the closing of Eleusis in 392 CE and the dancing streets of Strasbourg in 1518? Was it gradually lost, generation after generation, as the institutional structures that held it were dismantled? Or was it suppressed by a church that could not distinguish between controlled, sacred pharmacology and demonic possession, because from the outside they looked identical, or perhaps it was never passed down? A secret kept so closely for 2 millennia that when its guardians disappeared, it simply ceased to exist? We may never know. What we do know is that a woman named Frau Trophia danced to death on a street in Strasbourg, and the city around her had eaten something. The question is, during which interval did that knowledge disappear? From the closure of Eleusis to the death dances of Strasbourg, a vast gap in understanding left terrible consequences. In a different context, with a different method of preparation, with a different hand measuring the doses, what was once regarded as a sacrament, from the greatest minds of humanity, originating from the blood-soaked streets of Strasbourg, we crossed the Mediterranean to reach another civilization. They achieved pharmacological marvels 15 years before Plato was born, and left evidence on tomb walls, the Egyptian Blue Lotus. Step into any major Egyptian antiquities collection and look closely at what is being held. Not scepters, crooks, or symbols of royal power. Look at the flowers. A blue lotus, technically a water lily, brought to the nose at banquets, soaked into wine vats at festivals. Appearing in reliefs offered to the gods, present in over 5,000 surviving Egyptian artworks across 3,000 years of continuous civilization. For over a century, Egyptologists dismissed it as mere decoration, a symbol of creation, of the sun's daily rebirth from the waters, symbolizing regeneration and immortality, until chemists analyzed and discovered the flower's neurological effects. Nymphaea caerulea, the Egyptian blue lotus. It contains 2 major pharmacologically significant alkaloids, nuciferine and apomorphine. A 2020 study confirmed that extracts from Nymphaea carunculea produce anxiolytic and mild hallucinogenic effects, measurable in animal models, consistent with known activity on dopamine and serotonin receptors. A 2013 study in the British Journal of Pharmacology confirmed nuciferine is a partial agonist at the 5-HT2A receptor, the primary molecular target of psilocybin and LSD. This is not just a botanical curiosity, but a flower acting on the same receptors as classical hallucinogens, and was systematically consumed by one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history for 3,000 years. Howard Carter's excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 recovered not only Blue Lotus depictions but also actual specimens of the plant itself, preserved for over 3,000 years. Clothing with Blue Lotus patterns, pottery, and plant remains appeared in the funerary equipment of an 18-year-old pharaoh from the 18th dynasty. This is archaeobotanical evidence, physical material, not artistic inference. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the world's oldest medical documents, dating to around 1550 BCE and believed to be copied from sources as old as 3000 BCE, lists the blue lotus in pharmacological preparations. The clinical language describes applications for cardiac stimulation and dispelling grief, consistent with the pharmacological profile of nuciferine at the mechanistic level. Chemical analysis of residues inside Egyptian pottery at multiple sites confirmed the co-occurrence of blue lotus compounds in wine. Just as the artistic image of a lotus soaked in a jar of wine, extraction with alcohol dramatically increases alkaloid absorption, meaning the preparation method depicted in art turns out to be the optimal pharmacological approach. Surely someone understood that. The aporphine alkaloids in Nymphea caerulea are related to apomorphine, a substance being studied by modern medicine for treating Parkinson's. And also, as an adjuvant therapy for other neurological diseases, the Egyptian physicians who used the blue lotus may have hit upon the actual healing mechanism through a purely empirical path. Even without the pharmacological theoretical framework as we know it, clinical observation was sharp enough to recognize the effects of the compound and to develop optimal drug delivery methods. Scholar Jeremy Needle, in his work Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Texts, 2005, argues that the resurrection imagery in the Egyptian pyramid texts, the funerary texts describing the deceased transforming into a blue lotus before ascending to the afterlife, are actually encoding a literal pharmacological experience. The lotus blooms at dawn, closes at dusk, rising from mud and water. The texts speak of consciousness dissolving and being reborn. Nadler's reading is that Egyptian afterlife literature, at least in part, is an account of what high doses of blue lotus induce, rather than a system of metaphysical beliefs. Rather, it is a pharmacological record, clothed in the only language that culture had to express it. The orthodox view holds that the blue lotus is purely symbolic, and its appearance in art is a metaphor for creation and rebirth, a coherent interpretation and defensible on symbolic grounds. Egyptian art is infused with symbolism, and the visual characteristics of the lotus, its diurnal cycle, rising from water, make it a natural symbol for the sun and rebirth. This is not an unreasonable argument, but has a symbol ever been soaked in wine to enhance chemical bioavailability? The Egyptians were extremely meticulous visual recorders. They depicted scenes of bread making, brewing beer, and weaving linen on tomb walls with step-by-step process accuracy, because accurately depicting the process was how knowledge was preserved across generations. The Blue Lotus scenes follow the same visual logic as those production processes. Something being prepared, distributed, and used, not merely contemplated. The question is not whether the lotus has symbolic meaning. Of course it does. But whether it also has pharmacological significance. And chemistry answers yes. Are there other symbols in Egyptian civilization that are pharmacological records we have not yet deciphered? What other preparations, with similarly meticulous process accuracy, await a chemist to match them with what they appear on Egyptian walls? Now let us turn to the frozen bogs of northern Europe, where the past is preserved not in stone but in flesh, and where archaeologists, they discovered something more terrifying than any painting. The food in the stomachs of those who had used these plants millennia ago remained intact, waiting to be unearthed. Henbane. In the year 980 AD, a woman was being prepared for burial at Firkat, Jutland, Denmark. She was dressed in strange clothing, placed with an iron-tipped birch staff, a copper bowl, owl pellets, and at her side a small pouch. The pouch contained hundreds of seeds, which archaeologist Elsa Rostel confirmed in her 1990s excavation report as Haoma Niger Henbane. She was a vulva, a Norse CRS, a professional practitioner of cider, the Nordic shamanic tradition. The seeds were her tools. Neil Price, professor of archaeology at Uppsala University, described this frightened cat tomb and its pharmacological implications in his 2002 work, The Viking Way. Price has identified at least 13 other vulva graves across Scandinavia, showing consistent assemblages, staffs, unusual clothing, containers. The henbane in the frightened cat tomb was not a random addition. It was a professional toolkit, what she needed for her practice. Haoma Niger contains a trio of tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine. At low doses, scopolamine induces a peculiar dissociative state, described in clinical literature as the sensation that thoughts come from outside oneself, that one is receiving information rather than generating it. This is the pharmacological description of divine possession. This is the sound of a prophet from within, the Viking vulva, the Greek Pythia, the Celtic ritual practitioner in the sacred precinct. The same compound, the same receptor, the same subjective experience of transmission from outside, but expressed through completely different cultural vocabularies. 15 centuries ago, Theophrastus described henbane in his work Historia Plantarum, dating to around 300 BCE, noting that prophetic states could be induced by burning the plant and inhaling the smoke. This method, respiratory absorption of scopolamine, is pharmacologically plausible. The mucous membranes of the respiratory tract are an extremely efficient absorption surface, and the administration of volatile scopolamine would produce rapid onset and a relatively controlled duration of action. Someone before Theophrastus had discovered the optimal route of administration. A 2011 study of Iron Age ritual pits in Bavaria, Germany, found henbane seeds in concentrations consistent with intentional storage at sites associated with a sacred precinct called Virax Hansen. This is organized use of henbane in Celtic religious practice, not individual folk experimentation. The Velva burial pattern, the Greek oracle tradition, and the Celtic sacred precinct rituals point to a pan-European pharmacological tradition using the same plant for the same ritual purpose, across geographical distances that ordinary cultural diffusion can hardly explain. The witch's flying ointment recipes preserved in 16th century Inquisition court records. The testimonies of accused women in Germany, Italy, and Spain consistently show a combination of henbane with belladonna, datura, and mandrake, all rich in tropane alkaloids. In the 1960s, pharmacologist Will Eric Packard reconstructed an ancient formula and tested it on himself. He reported an experience lasting 20 hours. The experience included intense flying sensations, full visual hallucinations, and then almost complete memory loss, consistent with a scopolamine overdose. He lived the experience the women had described, proving they were completely right. Their accounts were not fabrications under torture, but first-hand pharmacological reports. Records describe applying ointment to specific body areas, a method of transdermal absorption far more sophisticated than direct ingestion. When scopolamine is absorbed through the skin on areas rich in mucous membranes, the dose-response curve becomes more controlled than when taken orally. Because the skin can regulate absorption rate in a way the digestive tract cannot, 20th century pharmaceuticals developed transdermal patches. The women burned alive in the 16th century had empirically discovered this principle, while the orthodox view holds that the vulva was used only with henbane, that the Oracle of Delphi was actually a geological phenomenon from ethylene gas, and that the records of witch ointments are mainly products of Inquisition, pressure, and fabrication, a view supported by many reputable scholars with solid evidence, not easily dismissed. But his flight was not a metaphor. He applied the ointment and truly experienced what the records describe. The drug worked exactly as ancient sources claimed. When a document is pharmacologically accurate, one must wonder what else in it is also true. From the myths of Norse seeresses, we move south to the empire that built roads across the ancient world and forget how to anesthetize patients. Mandrake, Rome, 65 AD. You are a military surgeon in Emperor Nero's legion. A soldier with an abdominal wound needs surgery. You have no ether, chloroform, or nitrous oxide. All you have is a moist sponge. You hold it under the soldier's nose. He inhales, and within minutes is unconscious. You cut, and he feels no pain. An hour later, he wakes up. That is general anesthesia. This method was effective and would not be officially reinvented for 18 years. Spongia somnifera, the sleeping sponge, appears in Roman medical texts with detailed preparation instructions. A 9th century manuscript at the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino records a formula of juices from Papaver somniferum, Mandragora officinarum, Conium maculatum, Hyoscyamus niger, and Solanum nigrum are boiled together. The sponge is soaked, then dried for storage. When used, moisten it again and hold it under the patient's nose. Absorbed through the respiratory tract, the combination of alkaloids takes effect. Opiates from the opium poppy, tropanes from mandrake and henbane, the neurotoxic alkaloids from hemlock and nightshade create a pharmacological property that today we accurately call dissociative general anesthesia. Mandragora officinarum contains hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine, compounds still fully utilized by modern medicine. They are preoperative sedatives, antispasmodics, and nerve antidotes. the same compounds were once placed under the noses of patients by Elizabethan physicians. The very same molecule is today injected intravenously by modern anesthesiologists, only the route of administration differs, while the composition remains unchanged. It was not invented by Dioscorides. Around 65 CE, the chief physician of Nero's army recorded that mandrake wine induced a state of insensibility to pain, enough to perform cutting and cauterizing surgeries. This is the oldest surviving surgical anesthetic prescription in Western medicine. He described in detail the preparation, precise dosage, and effective reversal procedure. Dioscorides was writing about battlefield medicine. Under military conditions, he did not theorize idly but recorded what actually worked. That is the work of the Roman physician Josephus. He described the anesthetic properties of mandrake root in such detail that modern pharmacologists must acknowledge its accuracy, compared to the actual alkaloid content of the plant. The Salerno Medical School, established in the 9th–10th century CE, is honored as the first secular medical school in Europe, included the soporific sponge in the official Pharmacopoeia Antidotarium Nicolae. This was not folk remedy but certified institutional medicine, yet from the mid-14th to the 17th century, it disappeared from clinical practice. The real challenge lay in dosage, something that would worry anyone who ponders it. The effective anesthetic dose of mandrake and the lethal dose were separated by a fragile 2-to-1 ratio in some preparations. Just double it, and the patient would never wake up. Ancient and medieval physicians maintained this delicate balance throughout centuries of practice. They achieved this without chemical analysis, without mass spectrometry, unable to measure alkaloid concentrations precisely to the milligram per milliliter. They maintained it through accumulated empirical knowledge encoded in preparation, procedures never fully replicated. William Morton's ether demonstration in Boston in 1846 is celebrated by medical history as the discovery of general anesthesia. Every medical student knows it, and it holds a prominent place in every surgical timeline. But it was Dioscorides who described functional surgical anesthesia in 65 CE. Shakespeare, writing only 15 years later, mentioned mandrake in Othello, Romeo and Juliet and Antony and Cleopatra as a surgical soporific with the phrase drowsy syrup, showing that as early as the 16th century. The cultural memory of its clinical role has not completely faded. The orthodox history of anesthesia has been off by at least 1,000 years. Why was the sleep sponge forgotten? Historians point to many converging factors. The association of herbal sleep induction with witchcraft under the Inquisition, the shift to rational medicine paradoxically discarded effective empirical treatments, along with what was truly magic, and the narrow therapeutic window made accidents easy, liability unpleasant. Whatever the cause, that knowledge vanished, and patients returned to being bitten on the skin, held down by 4 people. What other functional medical procedures have been cast aside, like ritualistic or symbolic treatments that actually worked? They were abandoned not because of failure, but because the cultural foundation of understanding them was destroyed. From the Roman operating table, we move to North Africa, to a city that once engraved a plant on its coins and watched it disappear. Silphium. Cyrene, now part of Libya, was founded as a Greek colony around 630 BC. Within a generation, it discovered its key economic advantage, a plant that grew only in a certain geographic area around the city and nowhere else on Earth. That plant was called Silphium. The Cyrenians engraved its image on coins. Julius Caesar stored 15 pounds, about 6.8 kilograms, in the Roman treasury alongside gold and silver, regarding it as a strategic reserve. Pliny the Elder saw the last specimen presented to Emperor Nero as a curiosity, and recorded this event as the loss of an irreplaceable thing. According to all historical sources from 6 centuries of consistent records, this was the most effective contraceptive of the ancient world. It has gone extinct, its pharmacological secret dying with it. This account is not folklore. Cyrannus of Ephesus, the greatest gynecologist of antiquity, around 100 AD, in his work Gynecology, gave dosage instructions for silphium as a contraceptive, a portion of the resin the size of a chickpea, taken monthly with wine. Cyrannus wrote the most sophisticated obstetrics and gynecology text of the ancient world. He did not prescribe sympathetic magic. He prescribed clinical medicine with clear dosage, timing, and route of administration. This was a pharmaceutical procedure. Dioscorides, Pliny, Theophrastus, and many other classical sources independently described the contraceptive properties of silphium. 6 centuries of attestation across multiple languages, multiple cultures, and multiple independent medical traditions. John Riddle, in his 1992 work, Contraception and Abortion from the Ancient World to the Renaissance, identified the most likely modern candidate as Ferula tingitana, or related Ferula species. He tested the contraceptive effectiveness of related Ferula species. Through mouse experiments, the nest inhibition effect reached about 40%, comparable to progesterone-based contraceptives. A 2022 article published in the journal Plants a proposal for a new potential candidate named Ferula druidiana, a rare plant found only in the Konya Plateau, Turkey. The authors affirm that this species is facing a serious risk of extinction. This matches the distribution range, morphological characteristics, and historical records of silphium. They urgently recommend conducting pharmacological trials immediately before this species also disappears forever. Do we have a second chance? But it seems we are about to miss it. Pliny's story of extinction deserves to be mandatory reading in every conservation biology training program. Pliny noted that this plant was destroyed not by disease or weather, but by overgrazing by the publicani. Private contractors who leased the Syria-Aegean grasslands from Rome realized that livestock grazing brought much higher profits than sustainable harvesting of silphium. The last plant was presented to Emperor Nero as a rare treasure, an irreplaceable herb, a molecule that evolution spent millions of years perfecting, and human civilization, which once took 6 centuries to perfect the clinical process, was destroyed by overgrazing within a single generation. In exchange for short-term economic gains, the heart shape on Syrian coins, the bilobed shape from silphium or galbanum seeds, has been mentioned by many historians as the origin of the modern heart symbol, an image associated with love and desire, a pharmaceutical brand for reproductive drugs abstracted over millennia. Regardless of whether that etymology is accurate, the symbol of the thing has outlived the thing itself. We preserve the symbol, but we lose the drug. A continent lost its medicinal plant because of the economy. Let's move eastward, across the ancient world, to a Central Asian desert, where archaeologists discovered processing rooms, ephedra plants, and the mystery of Haoma. Karakum Desert, Turkmenistan, 1986. Soviet archaeologist Viktor Sarianidi was excavating the Bronze Age complex known as Gonur Tepe. The site, about 28 hectares in size, is one of the largest urban centers of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, existing from 2300 to 1700 BCE. He unearthed strange, hard-to-explain rooms, stone mortars, ceramic vessels with filter holes at the bottom, white ash, and traces of compressed plant remains on the floors. In the vessel residues, ephedra, cannabis, and papaver, opium poppy, all present together in the same space and same geological layer 4,000 years ago. Clearly, someone intentionally mixed these plants. Today, the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex is recognized as one of the key Bronze Age civilizations in Central Asia. With far-reaching cultural influence on the emerging Indo-Iranian traditions, as well as possible impact on early Vedic culture, Sarianidi published his interpretation in the work Margiana and Pre-Zarathustrianism in 1998, identifying these rooms as the place where Haoma, Soma, was prepared. This assertion sparked much debate. Subsequent archaeobotanical analyses strongly reinforced this hypothesis. Ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, the two main alkaloids in ephedra. Currently, pseudoephedrine, a controlled precursor compound for the production of methamphetamine, still serves as the main active ingredient in decongestant medications. When used in its raw form with ancient, primitive processing methods, the ephedra plant produces extremely powerful sympathomimetic effects: increased heart rate, heightened alertness, dispelling fatigue, and boosting physical stamina. In the Hamyasht hymns, Avesta Yasna 911, Haoma is described as a gift, granting warriors agility, granting the sick healing, and granting poets visions. 3 distinct effects, 3 types of compounds. Ephedra provides stimulation for the warrior, cannabis soothes pain and anxiety for the sick, and opium alkaloids induce visions for the poet. The combination of these 3 herbs is not random. It is a pharmacological specificity dedicated to the 3 recorded effects. In 2003, a chemical study on the residue of a Bronze Age vessel from the Bimak region, published in the journal Economic Botany, discovered traces of alkaloids matching both ephedra and cannabis in the same vessel. This is the first direct chemical evidence of a multi-plant preparation. The tools excavated at Göner Tepe and the nearby Togalak 21 area include filter vessels with perforated patterns that correspond exactly to the filtration process described in the Haoma ritual of the Avesta, as well as in the hymns about the preparation of Soma in the Rigveda. Tools, herbs, texts, and chemical evidence all align with each other across 4,000 years. At certain concentrations, the alkaloids in ephedra act as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It is this type of compound, when combined with hallucinogenic tryptamines such as DMT, that creates much more powerful and prolonged visual experiences. This is the pharmacological basis of ayahuasca. And if the hypothesis about the multi-plant combination at BMAC is correct, then it is also the underlying pharmacological principle of Haoma and Soma. The Bronze Age priests in Turkmenistan could very well have exploited the same molecular synergy that Amazonian shamans independently discovered on the other side of the world. Two civilizations, the same chemical foundation. Today, the Zoroastrian community in Iran still maintains a version of the Haoma ritual, using a species of ephedra. The preparation steps: grinding in a stone mortar, pressing through a fiber filter, mixing with milk, identical to what is recorded in the Avestan texts, and perfectly matching the functional purpose of the tools found at Göner Tepe. This ritual has been continued with some variations for nearly 4,000 years. The preparation room is still in use today, except it no longer takes place in the Karakum Desert. Scholars are debating whether the descriptions of visions in the Avesta and Rigveda are a reflection of actual pharmacological effects, or merely poetic exaggeration of a milder stimulant experience. This is a valid question. Ephedra itself does not produce visual hallucinations. However, the residue at BMAC does not reveal the presence of ephedra alone. The multi-herb combination, stimulants, cannabinoids, and opiates, with potential MAO-inhibiting interactions, constitutes a completely different pharmacological hypothesis, one that has yet to be systematically reconstructed in controlled experiments. Could the monks at Göbekli Tepe have been pharmacological experimenters, dedicating generations to conducting field observations? They discovered that mixing certain herbs in specific proportions produced effects that individual herbs alone could not. And what if the ritual itself was the container preserving the formula? The structure of the ritual preserved the order of preparation and ingredient ratios across generations without needing a single page. And suppose the loss of the formula did not come from gradual erosion, but from a distinct historical rupture, the shift of the BMAC culture, the separation between the Vedic and Zoroastrian traditions, along with the priestly class being absorbed into new cultural orders without fully transferring knowledge. From the fire temples of the desert, we turn north and west to the Roman surgical theaters, where another form of pharmacological essence was being practiced directly on the human body. Belladonna, Florence 1520. A noblewoman preparing for an appearance before the court. She holds a small glass vial, tilting it over each eye, letting a drop of liquid fall onto each cornea. Within minutes, her pupils dilate to twice their normal size. In the candlelit reception rooms of the Medici family, her eyes shine with an unbelievable brightness, darkness, and depth. That preparation was the essence of Atropa Belladonna, beautiful woman, the deadly nightshade. The beautifying effect was entirely real. The same compound, if prepared slightly differently and taken in a slightly larger dose, would induce hallucinations lasting 3 full days. A little more would stop her heart. Atropa Belladonna contains atropine and scopolamine, two of the most pharmacologically important compounds in medical history. Atropine is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It is used to treat cardiac arrhythmias, as an antidote for nerve agents, and in ophthalmic interventions, where it dilates the pupils for examination, exactly as Renaissance nobles used it for cosmetic purposes. Scopolamine is a standard preoperative anxiolytic. The molecule has not changed, only the context of use has changed. Dioscorides recorded the preparation, dosage, and effects of belladonna in De Materia Medica around 65 AD with pharmacological accuracy that astonishingly matches today's understanding of the dose-response relationship of atropine and scopolamine. Pliny the Elder also noted in his Naturalis Historia published in 77 AD, that belladonna mixed with wine caused dose-dependent bouts of madness, and that Roman physicians had formulated specific antidotes for overdose cases. The standardized overdose treatment protocols indicate that overdoses occurred frequently enough to require them, and this in turn reveals that clinical drug use was common enough to form a significant patient population. The witch ointment formulas preserved in the Inquisition's records from the 15th to the 17th centuries describe applying belladonna preparations to specific sites on the body, especially areas rich in mucous membranes. Around 1470, Inquisitor Judge Jordanes de Bergamo recorded women applying ointment to wooden objects before experiencing a sensation of flying. In the 1930s, pharmacologist Gustav Schenk tested a homemade belladonna ointment on himself and noted an experience lasting over 24 hours. Those sensations included vivid flying, hallucinations of turning into animals, and a blurred boundary between dream and reality, which he published in his 1955 work. In the Book of Poisons, he experienced exactly what Inquisition records had said about women. A 1994 paper by toxicologist Michael Reck confirmed that the alkaloid concentration in historical belladonna preparations was fully sufficient to produce a genuine hallucinatory experience through transdermal absorption. At higher doses, scopolamine causes near-complete amnesia of the experience. A person can undergo hours of hallucinations with no subsequent memory, and the memory of the experience vanishes entirely. Because of this property, belladonna became valuable in contexts that Renaissance poison literature called torture for interrogation. This makes confessions at witch trials even harder to evaluate. Some women who told of flying and shapeshifting may have actually been reporting real pharmacological effects, but they remembered nothing of them afterward, only being told by others and accepting them as their own memories. Due to absolute amnesia, knowledge of the transdermal absorption method is what remains. Someone before the 16th century, even before the 15th century, before any surviving texts on the specific technique, discovered that applying tropane alkaloids to the skin produced a more controllable and distinct experience than oral ingestion. This was not an obvious discovery, because ingesting is the default method. The decision to apply a substance to the skin at a specific site to achieve a specific absorption pathway requires either a theoretical framework about how the body absorbs compounds, which ancient scholars lacked from a modern perspective, or an extremely meticulous empirical observation process that systematically tested application methods over many generations. Either way, someone practiced experimental pharmacology, and that experiment succeeded. The mainstream view sees belladonna use as merely part of a broader European folk herbal tradition, dangerous and inconsistently applied, and ultimately a mix of genuine intoxication and interpretation within a cultural framework. This view is defensible, but the sophistication of the application method suggests something beyond randomness. The women burned for knowing this were, pharmacologically speaking, correct. From the poison gardens of Europe, we turn to the banks of the Nile, where physicians 3,000 years ago handled medical issues that Victorian medicine could not. Opium and the Ebers Papyrus. In 1873, Georg Ebers, a German Egyptologist, purchased a papyrus scroll from a merchant in Luxor. That scroll was about 20 meters long. The text is inscribed on 110 mysterious hieratic columns, containing over 800 precious remedies, originating around 1550 BCE, although many scholars believe it was copied from even older documents dating back as far as 3000 BCE. The herbal medicine section contains clinical records so precise they seem as if written today. This is a special remedy specifically for soothing fussy babies, a pediatric sedative containing opium-derived narcotics, with extremely detailed dosage instructions and a warning to use only within 4 days. This limitation was clearly intentional to prevent respiratory depression, a condition that frequently claimed infant lives in Victorian England up to 3,000 years later. The Ebers Papyrus is currently preserved at the University of Leipzig. Medical historian John Nunn devoted many pages in his 1996 work to a meticulous analysis of it. In his work, Ancient Egyptian Medicine, he identified the pediatric preparation with the standard Egyptological code Ebers 782 as essentially a water-soluble opium extract. The ingredients of the preparation include poppy seeds, fly dirt, and water. After filtering, the solution was used for 4 days, with a specific note on this duration. This is evidence of clinical awareness of addiction risk. The 4-day limit was not magical or ritualistic. It was set simply because someone had observed the consequences of prolonged use. When used beyond 4 days, base ring pottery vessels were found, a distinctive upside-down shaped Cypriot jar, often associated with storing opium. These vessels mimic the seed pod of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. Residues inside have tested positive for opium alkaloids in multiple studies, and they were widely traded across the eastern Mediterranean. In 1992, chemical archaeologist Robert Marilis and his colleagues detected traces of opium alkaloids in base ring jars, dating from 1650 to 1350 BCE. Using radioimmunoassay, they obtained the first direct chemical confirmation. These jars indeed contained opium, not just a symbol of the poppy plant. When examining the geographical distribution, this pottery appears at archaeological sites in Canaan, Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus within the same strata, indicating the existence of an organized pharmaceutical trade network. This network operated concurrently across 4 civilizations, hundreds of nautical miles apart during the Late Bronze Age. The legendary Egyptian physician Imhotep, associated with even older texts, those texts predate the Ebers Papyrus by over 1,000 years. Some sources suggest they relate to early poppy-based preparations for pain relief, if these connections are accurate. The recorded use of opium in Egypt extends to several centuries after the First Dynasty, pushing back the timeline of sophisticated opium medicine to a period when most civilizations on Earth were still organized as subsistence agricultural societies. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was a pediatric product containing opium, sold openly in the US and UK, with a marketing campaign targeting the soothing of teething babies. This product caused a series of recorded infant deaths from respiratory depression throughout the 19th century. The American Medical Association did not officially condemn it until 1911. Meanwhile, the pediatric formula on the Ebers Papyrus had demonstrated dosage calibration and a clear 4-day limit thousands of years earlier. Far beyond the AMA's official recognition of opioid toxicity in children, stretching back 3,460 years, this is not merely a footnote, it is a structural challenge. Bound up with the story of medical progress, the paintings in the Theban tombs of the New Kingdom, c. 1550–1070 BCE, depict scenes that Egyptologist Lisa Manish explains are precisely depictions of opium preparations used clinically, visual proof that handwritten formulas were being put into practice. Pharmaceutical knowledge didn't exist, only in theory it was operational, and the trade network supplying it, the ring-based pottery system, was organized with a scale and complexity that reveals a prior developmental process. Suppliers were established, routes were formed, prices were stable, demand was ready. One cannot build a trans-Mediterranean pharmaceutical supply chain in a single generation. The mainstream view holds that Egyptian medicine blended empirical observation with magical ritual, and that the precise dosage language in the Ebers Papyrus may be merely a probabilistic convention rather than a systematic pharmacological understanding. This is reasonable and honest. We cannot fully assess clinical consistency when written procedures were adhered to in practice. But the 4-day limit is not magical. No ritual, incantation, or charm is attached to that number. It exists because clinical observation created it. Someone watched, someone counted the days, someone recorded the results. That is not superstition, that is medicine. What other islands of evidence-based practice lie buried in the texts we still read as myth? From the Nile, we go north, across the Mediterranean, to a drug on this list that Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius all used, and all spoke of it in the language of absolute transformation. And all were legally prohibited, on pain of death, from telling you anything. Soma. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a text of 114 hymns, all dedicated to a single drink. Not a god, not a ritual, not a philosophical concept, but a drink. The Rig Veda is the oldest surviving religious text in the world. Its composition dates to around 1,500–1,200 BCE, with an oral tradition possibly centuries or millennia older. The 9th book, the Soma Mandala, consists entirely of hymns praising the preparation, filtering, and enjoyment of a divine drink called Soma. In 3,000 years of scholarly research, no one has reached a consensus on its composition. Rig Veda 8:48 verse 3 records, "We have drunk Soma, we have become immortal, we have come to the light, we have found the gods." This is not metaphor in the way modern religious language often uses it. The surrounding text is specifically procedural. The plant is pressed between stones called graven. It is filtered through a woolen sieve called pavitra, mixed with milk and water in precise sequences. The preparation steps are specific, repeatable, and technical, and the effects described immortality, divine visions, physical strength, radiant clarity do not match any plant ever identified. In the field of modern pharmacology, mycologist R. Gordon Watson, whose works laid the foundation for the study of ancient plants, presented his candidate in his 1968 book Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, which was Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom. That was the identity of Soma. Claude Lévi-Strauss supported this hypothesis, and the academic debate it sparked has lasted over half a century. The core problem. The Rig Veda describes the Soma plant as leafless, rootless, and growing on high mountains. However, Amanita does not possess any of these three characteristics. This does not match the morphological description at all. Since Watson's time, serious scholars have proposed at least 30 different candidate plant species. David Flattery and Martin Schwartz proposed the Syrian rue, Peganum harmala, contains harmaline, a strong MAO inhibitor. When combined with a plant containing DMT, it produces a complete visual experience, identical to the chemical combination in Amazonian ayahuasca. Botanist S. Mahdi Hassan hypothesized that Soma was actually a multi-plant preparation, an ancient polydrug with a synergistic effect that no single species could replicate. Later, Victor Sarianidi discovered processing rooms at the BMAC sites of Gonur Tepe and Togolok, 21 inches Turkmenistan, dating to 2100-1800 BCE, indicating that Sarianidi identified these as Soma processing Haoma, with plant remains of ephedra, cannabis, and opium poppy in the same space. A 2003 study in the journal Economic Botany confirmed alkaloid profiles consistent with ephedra and cannabis in the same container. Analysis by archaeobotanist Mark Merlin also confirmed ephedra remains at multiple BMAC sites. The BMAC culture coincides geographically and temporally with the area proposed as the origin of the Vedic tradition. The processing equipment perfectly matches the ritual steps described in the Soma mandala. The modern Zoroastrian community in Iran still performs the Haoma ritual using ephedra species. The processing procedure: pound in a stone mortar, press through a fiber filter, mix with milk, exactly as described in the Rig Veda. For 4,000 continuous years, this processing method has survived in living practice. The steps have not been lost, but the original formula, if it was a multi-plant preparation, may have been simplified over millennia as the priestly class knowledgeable about the full combination was absorbed into new cultural orders. The Orthodox view holds that the mystery of Soma's identity reflects the complexity of the ancient texts, rather than pharmacological impossibility. The plant most likely is ephedra. The visual descriptions are merely poetic exaggeration. The substitution of different plants in different branches of the Vedic tradition explains why later descriptions differ from earlier ones. This is a coherent argument. It is also possible, but Rig Veda 8:48, verse 3 reads like a first-person pharmacological report: heat in the chest, the expansion of consciousness. The feeling of physical strength and mental clarity are not metaphors borrowed from belief, but pure observations from the body. Someone tasted something and described the sensation in words so precise that it has survived for 3,000 years through oral tradition. That drink produced an effect that for 3,000 years the most elite scholars could not replicate from any single source. The formula, if it truly existed, has disappeared, and the void it left bears the shape of what once worked. It is a category of loss. This is not just the past, it is ongoing. The knowledge encoded in the Soma mandala was not erased by a single catastrophe, but gradually disintegrated over time. When the human infrastructure that sustained it, a distinct priestly class, a specific processing tradition, a deep repository of botanical knowledge, gradually disappeared, dispersed, absorbed, and replaced without transfer. The texts remain, but not the practice. The secret lies hidden in the hymns if you know how to decode them. And for 3,000 years, the world's most elite scholarship could not decode it. That is the true meaning of loss, beginning with the lost formulas of the Vedic priesthood. The journey takes us east across the Himalayas, to a civilization that recorded what the Greeks and Egyptians refused to preserve, a pharmacological tradition. That tradition did not die with its practitioners, but was institutionalized, systematized, and woven into the governing apparatus of the empire. For 2,000 continuous years, and in one of its most famous preparations, it may have created the longest-lasting pharmaceutical mystery in human history. Ephedra and the Legacy of the Yellow Emperor, Shenong Ben Cao Jing, the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica, is the foundational text of Chinese pharmacology. The remedies in the book are traditionally attributed to the legendary Shenong, the Divine Farmer, who is said to have personally tasted hundreds of plants. To determine medicinal properties, he recorded his observations and, according to some sources, ultimately died from accumulated toxicity in his body. The extant text was compiled between 200 BCE and 200 CE, though it preserves botanical and clinical knowledge that had been orally transmitted centuries earlier. It classifies 365 substances into 3 grades: superior, medium, inferior, based on toxicity, indications, and what modern pharmacology calls therapeutic index. This classification system is not magical. It has a clear structure, predating by nearly 2,000 years, the rational pharmacopoeia organizing principles of the European Renaissance. In the medium grade is Ma Huang, Ephedra sinica, the same genus, possibly the very species we saw 4,000 years ago, in the processing rooms of Goner Tepe, but where the BMAC practitioners seem to have mixed it with cannabis and opium. To create visual effects, Chinese physicians isolated its function, adjusted dosages, and integrated it into a clinical framework. The Shenong Ben Cao Jing once subtly distinguished disorders of sweating, signs of cold, wheezing from asthma, and edema. Ma Huang was prescribed for symptoms that modern medicine today identifies as bronchospasm and acute respiratory distress. Yes, that's ephedrine. In 1885, from the Ma Huang plant, Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayoshi isolated an alkaloid, a wonderful bronchodilator that expands the airways. It became the gold standard for acute asthma attacks. Throughout the early 20th century, before being replaced by compounds with shorter duration and more specific receptor affinity, Chinese physicians, prescribing Ma Huang for wheezing 2,000 years before Nagai wasn't vague reasoning, those physicians were actually doing pulmonary science. The impressive point is not only that they knew this plant had benefits, it's the precision in indication. The Shenong Ben Cao Jing did not prescribe Ma Huang indiscriminately for any cough. It only prescribed it for very specific manifestations: wheezing accompanied by cold hands and feet, wheezing without sweating, wheezing with distinct pulse characteristics. Those are the differential diagnostic criteria. This ancient text is not merely listing a medicinal herb, it's selecting the appropriate patients for that herb, distinguishing cases that will be effective from cases where a different compound is indicated. That is clinical reasoning. That is the structure of evidence-based prescribing. The Han Dynasty physician, Zhang Zhongjing, he wrote around 200 AD in his work Treatise on Cold Damage, a discourse on cold-induced disorders, and expanded the theoretical framework. He recorded sophisticated combination formulas. Ma Huang was combined with cinnamon, apricot seed, and licorice in specific weight ratios, tailored to each distinct syndrome manifestation. These combinations were not random. Compounds in cinnamon promote blood circulation. Glycyrrhizin from licorice prolongs the half-life of corticosteroid-like compounds. This is very important, because some traditional Chinese medicine formulas inadvertently enhance the natural cortisol response. The chemistry of the combination is empirical, but entirely grounded. Zhang Zhongxing's formulas are still used in modern clinical practice in China, Japan, and Korea. In pharmacies governed by modern pharmaceutical safety regulations, 18 years of continuous clinical use, with the same formula, same indications, and the same results. Nagai Nagayoshi's isolation of ephedrine in 1885 sparked a global pharmaceutical revolution. By the 1920s, ephedrine had become a standard ingredient in Western asthma therapies. By the 1930s, the structural similarity between ephedrine and the adrenaline molecule, recently described, was thoroughly understood, and ephedrine became the template molecule for the synthesis of amphetamine, methamphetamine, as well as a new generation of sympathomimetic drugs that would transform 20th century pharmacology, enhance military performance, psychiatric treatment, and even recreational stimulant culture. Any pseudoephedrine decongestant pill on pharmacy shelves worldwide today carries its molecular origin from a plant that a Chinese physician used thousands of years ago. From 2,000 years ago, in a textbook attributed to a legendary emperor who tasted herbal remedies himself and died, this plant was prescribed for patients with wheezing. However, Ma Huang is not a mystery. It is a brilliant success story, where ancient and modern pharmacology can shake hands across 2 millennia and realize they were doing the same work. This medicinal plant was recorded in the Chinese pharmacopoeia with detailed clinical descriptions, incorporated into complex formulas, passed down through generations, chemically isolated in the 19th century, and its molecular structure determined. It was synthesized and is still used in controlled pharmaceuticals today. The chain of transmission never broke, knowledge accumulated, never dispersed. This is the image of an institutional pharmacology spanning continuously over 20 centuries, and it is a rare exception. This is not the norm in human medical history. Most similarly, ancient and sophisticated pharmacological traditions have disappeared. Chinese herbal medicine survived because of sustaining institutions, the imperial medical apparatus, a professional class of physicians, and officially published pharmacopoeias, along with a systematic apprenticeship system and temple pharmacies that remained strong through all periods of dynastic transition, to the extent that no political upheaval could break the chain of transmission. When the Han fell, the Tang preserved it. When the Tang fell, the Song expanded it. When the Mongols came, they adopted it. When the Ming consolidated, they systematized it. But the mystery lies in another part, in the upper tier of the Shenong Benchao Jing. In the section for the purest and least toxic substances, there is an entry on a compound called poria, and beside it is an entry that has resisted precise identification for over 1,000 years. The text describes a mushroom called lingji, now commonly identified as Ganoderma lucidum, the reishi mushroom. Yet, the original descriptions in the Shenong Benchao Jing and later Tang and Song pharmacopoeias describe 6 types of lingji, distinguished by color: red, purple, blue, white, yellow, and black. Modern mycology can confidently identify only 2, perhaps 3. The remaining ones could be extinct species or entirely different organisms, or special preparations from known species under conditions that produce distinct alkaloid profiles, or they could be things that no longer grow where Chinese herbalists are currently searching. Taoist alchemists of the Tang dynasty used these preparations and described effects that modern extracts cannot replicate, prolonging lifespan far beyond normal, visionary states during meditation, what an 8th century text called the dissolution of boundaries between the meditator and the mountain. We do not know what they used, but we know it was classified as a supreme grade substance, meaning its therapeutic window was very wide. Its toxicity is extremely low, and we know it is so rare and expensive that emperors once hoarded it. Moreover, whatever that purple color is, no mycologist in the world has ever been able to cultivate it successfully. Cassia and the mystery of cinnamon. In ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus mentioned cassia. In the Hebrew Bible, Exodus chapter 30, from verses 23 to 25, cassia is identified as an important ingredient in the holy anointing oil, with its weight precisely specified in shekels. And in the Greek pharmacopoeias of Theophrastus and Dioscorides, cassia appears as a therapy for circulatory disorders, and also as an essential component in many compound formulas, along with other cardiovascular-directed ingredients. In the Tamil Sangam literature of southern India, dating to around the 1st century AD, a substance called ilavangam appears, very likely cassia, or a closely related cinnamomum species, and it appears in medical contexts that today we consider the symptoms of type 2 diabetes, frequent urination, unquenchable thirst, slow healing wounds. The ancient Tamil physicians prescribed cassia bark to treat what we now call hyperglycemia, and they were right. Many modern studies, including a 2003 trial in the journal Diabetes Care, have confirmed that compounds from Cinnamomum cassia, especially the polymer methyl hydroxychalcone, help increase insulin sensitivity and reduce fasting blood glucose in type 2 diabetes patients, an effect that is modest but fully measurable, reproducible, and mechanistically explainable. The ancient Tamil physicians knew nothing about insulin, nor about blood glucose regulation. They were completely ignorant of cell receptor sensitivity, but they observed that patients had clusters of symptoms, they prescribed the bark, and then monitored improvement. And they recorded those observations in clinical collections that have survived for 2,000 years. This is purely observational pharmacology, operating without any theoretical framework that modern medicine demands, yet still arriving at a fundamentally correct conclusion, based entirely on the power of empirical pattern recognition. A haunting question: how many other prescriptions from the Sangam era, unvalidated by modern science, are equally accurate? The Tamil texts preserve hundreds of herbal remedies for specific clinical symptoms. Many of the plants still grow in southern India and Sri Lanka. These clinical descriptions are detailed enough to support modern differential diagnosis, but most of them have never been systematically tested. A research budget, more modest than a phase 3 trial of a new synthetic compound, could evaluate all the remaining Sangam medicinal plants within a decade, but no one does it. That body of knowledge lies dormant in libraries, in manuscripts, in temple archives, waiting in vain. The plants still grow green, the texts are still readable, the research tools are ready, but there seems to be a lack of will. From the temple gardens of southern India, we cross the Pacific to a continent where pharmacology was developing independently, undiscovered by any of the civilizations we have mentioned, and that very place gave birth to. This must be the most chemically sophisticated ritual preparation in the ancient world: cacao, ololiuqui, and the Mexican pharmacopoeia of Tenochtitlan. In 1519, the Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún began documenting what would become the most comprehensive ethnographic account of any pre-Columbian civilization. Compiled decades after the conquest, the Florentine Codex describes the medical and ritual practices of the Mexica, in which Sahagún identifies a special class of practitioners, called ticatil, healers, along with the substances they used, including a preparation called ololiuqui, extracted from the seeds of a morning glory species. The Mexica described its effects as seeds that speak, seeds that reveal mysteries, seeds that bring the user into the presence of the divine. As a Catholic priest, Sahagún considered this practice diabolical, yet he meticulously recorded it, even with botanical illustrations, enough to be identified in modern times. In 1960, Albert Hofmann, the very Sandoz chemist who had synthesized LSD 22 years earlier, analyzed ololiuqui seeds provided by ethnobotanist Richard Schultes. The seeds came from Turbina corymbosa, also known as Rivia corymbosa, a morning glory species native to Mesoamerica. Hofmann identified the active compounds as lysergic acid amides. These compounds are structurally related to LSD, acting pharmacologically on the same receptors, producing qualitatively similar effects, but with weaker potency and shorter duration. The Mexica used a natural lysergamide in rituals with controlled dosages, within an organized religious framework, for at least several centuries before contact, and possibly up to 2,000 years. This is the same chemical family as ergot, the compounds that Hofmann synthesized in the Basel laboratory in 1938, the very compounds that had caused the Dancing Plague in Strasbourg in 1518, and also the compounds that the priests at Eleusis may have used in the sacred kykeon for 2,000 years, the same compounds that Mexican practitioners were using in rituals in central Mexico. When Cortés arrived, 3 continents, 3 civilizations, 3 completely independent traditions converged on the same family of chemicals with the same purpose: structured access to extraordinary states under institutional supervision. This is either a marvelous coincidence or evidence that the human nervous system has only a limited number of receptors which, when activated, produce experiences so meaningful that any civilization, given enough time, would discover them. The Mexica Pharmacopoeia is recorded in the Florentine Codex and in the Badianus manuscript of 1552, the oldest surviving herbal of the New World, containing hundreds of medicinal plants with specific clinical indications. The Badianus manuscript was compiled by the Aztec physician Martin de la Cruz and translated into Latin by Juan Badianus. Trained at Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco, two native physicians described remedies for heart rhythm disorders, preeclampsia and postpartum hemorrhage, dysentery, and countless other diseases. Chemistry has analyzed many plants. Among them, many possess compounds with powerful pharmacological activity. Based on recorded instructions, the Mexica were not guessing, they actually prescribed. And then there was cacao, Theobroma cacao, the food of the gods. The Mexican nobility used it as a bitter, spiced drink and also in ritual offerings to the gods. This drink contains theobromine and caffeine, both methylxanthin stimulants, along with phenylethylamine. This is a mild neurostimulant compound. This combination provides alertness, mood improvement, and mild cardiovascular stimulation. Contemporary epidemiological studies have shown a link between regular intake of flavanols from cacao and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, as well as improved cognitive function in the elderly. In 2020, a meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that the blood pressure-lowering effect was proportional to the dose of cacao flavanols consumed. While the Mexica used it in rituals, the Maya, who had developed cacao processing techniques centuries earlier, considered it a medicinal herb. It served both as currency and as a sacrament. And they were not mistaken about its properties. The molecules in cacao indeed worked exactly as they used it. And they were right. When Tenochtitlan fell, what disappeared was not merely a city, a political institution, or a population. It was an entire pharmacopoeia built by physicians over millennia. Unrelated to the Old World traditions we discussed in previous sections, this medicine had independently developed sophisticated dosage adjustment techniques, standardized administration rituals, and integrated neurostimulants into an organized religious framework. Spanish colonists destroyed thousands of codices. In 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa, in Yucatan, ordered the burning of all Maya manuscripts he could access. Later, he himself expressed regret for this act in his work, Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan. The Florentine Codex and the Badianis manuscript survived because they were compiled under the auspices of the Spanish Church for anthropological recording purposes, not because their content was acknowledged. In fact, they are only a tiny fraction of the once existent treasure. Only 4 Maya codices remain after the Yucatan burnings, from an original number that cannot be determined, possibly hundreds or even thousands. Each codex was like a miniature library containing astronomical, ritual, and medical knowledge accumulated over centuries. We have only 4. The rest are lost, and what is lost cannot be recovered. The Tizidal healers, who knew those remedies by heart, died of smallpox within the first generation of contact, or were killed, or forbidden to practice, or saw their students choose to study at Christian seminaries instead of pursuing indigenous medicine. For maintaining indigenous medicine had become socially dangerous. Within 3 generations, the chain of knowledge transmission was broken, and within 5 generations, even those who broke it forgot that there was once a treasure of knowledge to be inherited. From the burned libraries in central Mexico, we close this survey with a substance that once, perhaps the most commonly used psychoactive substance in the ancient Mediterranean, one that almost no modern reader realizes has psychoactive effects, was ancient wine. When you encounter in a Greek text that someone is drinking wine, you are reading a seriously misleading translation. The wine that appears in Plato's Symposia is completely different from the wine on a modern banquet table. Wine in the ancient Mediterranean was a base solvent into which a range of plant drugs were blended: opium, henbane, ephedra, jimsonweed, and many others. Henbane, ephedra, jimsonweed, cannabis resin, along with dozens of other compounds, all varying by region and occasion, as well as the wealth of the host. The Greek and Roman wines recorded in ancient texts were not wine in our modern sense. They were essentially complex botanical preparations, using alcohol as a solvent and flavoring agent. The alcohol content was typically very low, only about 4 to 6%, equivalent to a strong modern beer. The real pharmacological activity came from the additives. Patrick McGovern, a professor of molecular archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania, has spent decades chemically analyzing residues in ancient drinking vessels from the Mediterranean. His discoveries, published in numerous articles and summarized in the book Uncorking the Past, 2009, consistently show that ancient wine regularly contained psychoactive plant additives in sufficient concentrations. strong enough to produce pharmacological effects far beyond those of alcohol alone. For example, the kykeon of Eleusis, which involved ergot, was also a wine preparation. The drugs Homer describes being given to Helen in the Odyssey to dispel grief and bring forgetfulness of pain, that too was a wine preparation, almost certainly containing opium. The wines consumed at Athenian feasts, where philosophical discussions were held around progressively diluted servings, were wines whose dilution was calibrated not only to control alcohol intake, but also to control the cumulative effect of various psychoactive ingredients. This means that when we read Plato describing the symposium as a place of high philosophical discussion, we are actually reading a description of an altered chemical state. The participants were not just tipsy, they were operating under the influence of a deliberately calibrated multi-component pharmacological preparation used in a ritualized social context. The philosophical content is real, but the chemical context is also real. The two cannot be clearly separated. In a sense, Plato's dialogues are the recorded products of a specific neuropharmacological state induced by a specific cultural technology. This is uncomfortable territory. It threatens to reduce philosophy to pharmacology, turning the highest human achievements into chemical accidents. But that is not what the evidence supports, nor what is being argued. What is being argued is that the cognitive and creative products of ancient Mediterranean civilization were produced by minds operating in a chemical environment significantly different from ours, and ignoring this fact will cause us to misunderstand their entire philosophical and cultural heritage, as well as losing the opportunity to properly understand what actually took place in the ancient symposia. Distorts our perception of those results. The Greeks were not merely people wearing togas, they were a people who systematically used psychoactive substances. Plant-based preparations played an essential role in daily social, religious, and intellectual life. Their philosophy sprouted from that context, and their poetry was cultivated in the same environment. Their political institutions were also debated and refined in that same context. The chemical foundation of Greek civilization is by no means a shameful footnote. It belongs to the framework of explanation, and later, the additives gradually disappeared due to a combination of Christian reforms in drinking practices, Islamic prohibitions. In the wine-producing regions of the southern Mediterranean, the loss of specific botanical knowledge along with the collapse of pagan religious infrastructure, and the gradual standardization of the wine industry solely around grape yeast. The tradition of multi-ingredient medicinal wine of the ancient Mediterranean had faded by around the 8th century AD. The vessels remain, the texts remain, but the recipes are lost. When you enjoy a glass of modern wine, you are drinking a solvent. The pharmacopoeia that solvent was designed to carry has long vanished. Departing from the diluted craters of the Athenian symposium, we head south one last time, to a river civilization that practiced surgery on a grand scale, with a sophistication that no other ancient society ever recorded, and left behind one of the most detailed clinical pharmacological texts in human history, the Sushruta Samhita and the ancient Indian surgical tradition. This scripture is attributed to the physician Sushruta. Compiled in northern India between 600 BCE and 100 CE, is the foundational surgical text of the Ayurvedic tradition. It describes 121 types of surgical instruments, classifies 300 surgical procedures, and provides detailed protocols for operations such as cataract removal, bladder stone removal, intestinal anastomosis, cesarean section, and perhaps the most famous procedure, nasal reconstruction using a forehead skin flap, a technique that European surgeons did not adopt until the late 18th century. The text describes the procedure step by step, including using a leaf as a template, the size and shape of the reconstructed part, the rotation of a vascularized skin flap from the forehead to cover the nasal defect, and post-operative care of the reconstructed tissue. British surgeons stationed in India witnessed the procedure performed by local physicians in 1793, were astounded, and this technique was published in the Gentleman's Magazine in London that same year. It officially entered European surgical practice as the Indian rhinoplasty. In India, it was performed by physicians, working in an unbroken tradition of nearly 2,000 years. What concerns us here is not surgery, but the pharmacology that accompanied it. Sushruta describes a preoperative sedation procedure combining wine with cannabis preparations, a method consistent with what modern pharmacology acknowledges today. Similar to the method of conscious sedation combined with cannabinoid anxiolysis, he presents how to control post-operative pain through opioid preparations at specific intermittent doses. He describes the method of preventing infection with honey-impregnated dressings, a technique that modern wound medicine has rediscovered in the context of increasing antibiotic-resistant infections. Today, medical-grade honey is used clinically due to its antibacterial properties through osmosis and hydrogen peroxide production. Yet, the Sushruta Samhita prescribed honey for wound healing millennia ago. 2,000 years before the molecular mechanism of action was understood, that mechanism remained a mystery, but the clinical observations were entirely accurate. The most outstanding feature of the Sushruta tradition is its institutional structure. The text described a training program lasting about 7 years. Practical examinations were conducted on corpses, gourds, and animal tissues, followed by supervised step-by-step practice on living patients before being granted a license for independent practice. There were standards, professional qualifications, and institutional continuity. Knowledge was not passed down in a folk manner, but transmitted as a formal profession. With quality control mechanisms to maintain clinical competence across generations, Indian medicine produced Sushruta. In the following centuries, there appeared the Karaka Samhita on internal medicine, the Ashtanga Hridaya on integrated practice, and the Bauer manuscript. Recovered from a 4th century stupa in Chinese Turkestan, this manuscript contains pharmacological formulas transmitted from the same tradition along the Silk Road. And this is the recurring pattern across every item we have examined. Knowledge that persists is institutionalized knowledge. Eleusis maintained his pharmacopoeia for 2,000 years. Because it was an institution, the Chinese pharmaceutical tradition endured by being firmly embedded in the imperial administrative apparatus and a continuous professional physician class. The Indian surgical tradition survived because it had a formal training program. What was lost was not due to individual practitioners dying, something everyone must undergo, but because the institutional structures transmitting knowledge across generations were destroyed or fragmented, or were absorbed into successor cultures that did not fully maintain the content. The mystery of Soma is the mystery of an institution that ended. The extinction of Silphium is the extinction of a supply chain that ceased. The Dancing Plague of Strasbourg is evidence of what happens when an institutional pharmacology disappears long enough that no one remembers what the actual molecule was. This is the striking lesson when looking at all these cases together. Knowledge is not preserved in individual minds. It is preserved in institutions, traditions, professional structures, and transmitted protocols. When those structures are intact, knowledge accumulates and refines itself over centuries. When those structures are destroyed, the knowledge they contained is not transferred to anything that replaces them. It simply ceases. Texts may survive, plants may survive, containers may survive, but the know-how, the procedural fluency and performance, that which turns a list of ingredients into living knowledge, is lost. The transformation into a functional compound has been lost, even sometimes irrecoverable, despite all the most modern analytical tools at our disposal. We are living in our own century. We establish pharmaceutical knowledge institutions, implicitly taking their continuity for granted. We tacitly believe that medical training programs will endure, that drug regulatory frameworks will remain stable. We assume that peer-reviewed journals will never disappear. We assume that pharmaceutical manufacturing infrastructure will last forever. None of these assumptions is certain. The institutions of Eleusis, of Siren, of Tenochtitlan, of the Han Dynasty's drug administration apparatus, all were equally powerful in their historical contexts and were likewise taken for granted by those who depended on them. And then, in each case, the institution collapsed and the knowledge it carried vanished. Successive cultures spent centuries piecing together fragments of what was lost, often unaware that what they were reconstructing had existed before. What you have reviewed across these 14 items is not a collection of oddities from history. It is a pattern whose shape ordinary human intellectual history does not fully explain. 14 compounds, 14 civilizations spanning 5 continents and nearly 4,000 years of human history. And when you lay them side by side, what emerges is the outline of a kind of science. Unlike the science of today, no laboratories, no peer review, no mass spectrometers, no randomized trials, but a science in a functional sense. Systematic empirical observations over generations about how specific compounds interact with the human body, encoded in rituals so precise that they maintained pharmaceutical consistency. For millennia, the priests at Eleusis appear to have maintained dosage accuracy of ergot for 2,000 years, serving tens of thousands of participants. The BMAC practitioners combined ephedra, cannabis, and opium into a multi-drug preparation whose molecular synergy is fully confirmed by modern biochemistry. Egyptian physicians refined pediatric opium doses with precision far exceeding Victorian medicine, the vulva of fear. Cats carried hundreds of datura seeds to their graves as tools of the trade. The physicians of Cyrene recorded a contraceptive procedure that a modern gynecologist would immediately recognize as a clinical structure. The practitioners of the sleeping sponge maintained a therapeutic window, so narrow that doubling the dose was fatal over centuries of clinical use. Without analytical chemistry, Chinese respiratory physicians prescribed ephedra to treat bronchoconstrictive manifestations as distinct as 18 years before ephedrine was isolated. Tamil physicians prescribed cassia for hyperglycemia. 2,000 years before insulin, the Mexica incorporated lysergamide into organized rituals, entirely independent of the Old World ergot tradition. Indian surgical schools maintained a 7-year training program with autopsies. They were not fumbling by chance. Come to the useful plants, here are the masters, with gathered, refined knowledge, ready to impart. The common view of ancient pharmacology is not unreasonable. It asserts that ancestors had genuine empirical discoveries about native plants, preserving them in rituals and myths, and occasionally produced effective medicines through trial and error. Their losses were real but unavoidable. Consequences of the fragile nature of oral transmission, along with ruptures due to conquest, disease, and cultural replacement. Modern chemistry has recovered and surpassed most of what was lost. That is a defensible argument, but there is one thing the orthodox view has not thoroughly addressed: the sophistication in the methods of administration, the polypharmacy regimens, dose adjustment procedures, the deliberate exploitation of molecular synergy. These are not the results of chance. They are the fruits of systematic observation spanning longer than the history of modern pharmacology. And when that knowledge was lost, it was not replaced by something better. It simply vanished, and humanity endured centuries, even millennia, with inferior remedies in its absence. Murdering infants with opium syrup, rediscovering anesthetics, burning women alive for knowledge of transdermal alkaloid absorption. How does this impact our perception of history? Perhaps that linear progress is only a comforting illusion, that knowledge does not accumulate steadily but erupts and convulses catastrophically, and that the boundary between ancient superstition and ancient science is far blurrier than we are taught. Perhaps the greatest pharmacological discoveries of the coming century will come not from new molecules, but from reconstructed ones, from formulas hidden within ritual texts, awaiting a reader with the perfect combination of archaeological and biochemical knowledge. You set foot here. Most people see those stories as mere footnotes or curiosities and scroll past. You stayed. You asked the core question, what did they know? And what did we lose when we stopped wondering? That question is uncomfortable. It has no neat answer. It plants in you a lingering unease that the history of human knowledge has pages we have not yet learned to decode. Excellent. That discomfort is the wellspring of true discovery. This channel is for those who reject the belief that history unfolds from textbook pages. For those who look at a 3,500-year-old medical papyrus and see a peer-reviewed clinical article in a dead language. For those who understand that a dancing plague on the streets of Strasbourg and a sacred ritual in the Eleusinian temple are connected by the same molecule, and what makes the difference is knowledge. If you are one of them, subscribe, you won't regret it. And don't forget to comment. Among these 14 compounds, which one do you think, if its original formula were reconstructed today, would have the most powerful impact on current medicine? I read all responses. The ancient Greeks had a single word meaning both medicine, poison, and magic. The concept of pharmakon reveals that they did not distinguish between types of medicines, for they understood that any healing substance inherently poses a risk of harm. Every altered state uncovers a truth about the structure of consciousness, and the boundary between divine vision and a lethal dose lies solely in preparation. What we call primitive pharmacology, in some manifestations, is far more sophisticated than its replacement. The fire temples of Gonur Tepe, the sanctuary of Eleusis, the burial pouch of a Viking seeress, the murals in New Kingdom tombs, and the imperial pharmacies of the Han dynasty. Sushruda's surgical amphitheater, these legacies are not relics of superstition, but treasures of a science we have only begun to restore. The practitioners are gone, but the molecules remain. Subscribe and continue the quest.